Frank Ricci is a fellow for labor and special initiatives at the Yankee Institute in Connecticut. He retired as battalion chief and union president for New Haven firefighters and has been awarded numerous commendations, including the Medal of Valor. He serves on the advisory board for Fire Engineering Magazine and has been qualified as an expert witness for court and administrative cases involving hazardous material incidents, structural fires, and promotional exams. Frank, thank you for joining us today.
Dave, it's an honor to be on your show. I'm going to have you do my obituary.
Well, Frank, I want to ask you some questions about your time as local union president, because I think it gives you some unique insight into how unions could better fulfill their purpose to represent rank and file employees. But before we talk about that, I'd just like a brief update about Connecticut state politics and how public sector unions affect what happens in Hartford. So what's happening in Connecticut right
Public sector unions affect everything that happens in Hartford. Nothing happens in Hartford at Connecticut State Capitol without going through a public sector union. It's really disheartening. Now, I completely understand, and there used to be a mantra that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But what we've seen in Connecticut is unions have moved past that. They're not trying to get a seat at the table. They're trying to control both sides of the table. And they've been successful, but almost to their own detriment. They've been so successful that they betrayed their membership. So most, even conservatives out there, they don't have an issue with a union advocating for wages, hours, and working conditions. But where it tends to go too far is when the unions weighing in on every social issue or weighing in on issues that have nothing to do with work, and essentially they become an arm of a political party. They're no longer issue advocates. And when you're an issue advocate, what a union's supposed to do is advocate for the workers. It shouldn't look at parties. It should be nonpartisan. You stand with those who stand with you. But it's moved to everything. And the whole entire source of Connecticut's crushing debt is all because of the public unions. And let me explain that, because I was a union member. I have health care. I have a pension. And I want workers treated fairly. What happened in Connecticut is, and I got to go down the road a little bit, but it's really going to bring this it'll be crystal clear for you, David, is that in
Yeah, great.
1971, Connecticut passed a law that said that the pensions had to be fully funded. The ARC, whatever the actuary said had to be funded, had to be funded. So we had a state law. If they followed that law, our pensions would have been fully funded by 1981, and Connecticut wouldn't have that crushing debt. And what they did was Republicans and Democrats agreed with the unions to supersede state law and not fund the pensions. So you had union presidents who were so selfish that they cut deals with Republicans and Democrats not to properly fund the pensions. They overrode the state law. That's what created that avalanche of billions and billions of dollars in debt that's crushing Connecticut's economy right now. We're crowding out whether you care about tax breaks, whether you care about education, social programs, whatever you care about. It doesn't matter. It's getting crushed because people made bad financial decisions, and what we saw was really poor governance from Republicans and Democrats. And one of the things that I see a lot of times is individuals, and I want to talk to the conservatives because you have a great viewership of a lot of conservatives across the country. A lot of conservatives get into power, whether it's on a board of education, whether it's governor or a state rep, and they think that their private sector experience of running a business translates to state or local labor law. It doesn't. And the Republicans tend to make the same mistakes as the Democrats, and the unions are playing chess and the politicians are playing checkers. And what we see, like with Board of Eds, is a perfect example. They complain about the unions, but they don't hold management accountable. They're missing part of the three-legged stool. You have to hold managers accountable, your superintendents, your elected officials. They have to be trained and have to be asking the right questions. Then you take on the unions, and you have to give a voice to parents on that Board of Ed model, on the state model, the taxpayers. Any union agreement made, and again, I want employees treated fairly, but any union agreement made is made in the name of the taxpayers. Yet 99% of the individuals that vote on these agreements from the Board of Ed, they're not trained, they don't know the right questions, and most of the time the superintendent's giving wrong information. So we need to tackle that three legs of that stool.
Hmm. So I did, when you talk about pensions, we did a study here that I'm not sure that any other state bargains the way that Connecticut does over pensions. A lot of those are set by state law. You're saying that unions wanted that, and that now, that responsibility of bargaining for pensions is kind of taken over
Oh,
state politics.
absolutely. It's totally taken over state politics, and it's the main driver for tax increases and why Connecticut's economy is in the tank. Is that here both sides made bad financial decisions, and the unions sold out their members because the unions knew that when they made this deal with the governors to not fund the pensions, they knew that the solvency of the pension wouldn't matter in the end, because once the contract was signed, the taxpayers would be on the hook for it. So what they did was they sold out
Hmm.
their younger members. And here's an example. I was a municipal union president in a very blue city, but I also looked across the country and did some research. I can't find any municipal union ever, any, that ever advocated for not funding their benefits, because eventually the check comes due, and eventually, even if the public's ignoring it, public scrutiny is going to get to a level where they're going to be saying, wait a second, we can't afford to live in this state anymore. We're all going to move to Tennessee, Florida, and Texas. So the bill comes due. So those union presidents really sold out their members when they should have always been advocating for it to be funded.
There is a serious outflow of taxpayers from Connecticut these days. Is that what this is all about? Is it the tax burden?
Absolutely. It's affordability. It's the tax burden, and it's also the electric bills, energy prices. Remember, energy policy, instead of embracing natural gas and small nuclear, New York has blocked a natural gas pipeline because of environmental factors from going through the state. So we're starved from natural gas, and then poor public policy on wind and solar, thinking it was going to save the nation. If you look at the grid right now in New England, it's being powered by oil, what they would consider dirty oil. So they're not even accomplishing their
Uh,
objectives. They may feel good with the wind and oil, but right now the only reason they feel warm is because of oil. And it would be much better to embrace natural gas and small nuclear and hydro and have a little mix. But when you over rely on something, those energy prices and the tax burden with the pension crisis is driving people out of Connecticut, and it's also stifling economic growth, because here, if you have a business and you can't afford your electric bill, and it's not workable. The state has become unaffordable, and that's what Yankees working is to try to make the state more affordable, workable, and livable.
so you think change is on the horizon?
We advocate for change every day. You can't change the world overnight, but you got to fight for
Uh-huh.
change every single day. I think it was C.W. Lewis who said, I believe in dragons not because they're real, but because they can be beaten, type of thing. Um, so yeah, we gotta keep up the fight and keep educating people. And we see some great people getting in positions. And Yankee has a training program for HR directors, first selectmen, politicians, uh, board of education members on not just, and this actually started under your leadership, Dave, is that I worked with you on explaining what a contract was and how it worked. And you were instrumental in that. But Yankee now has taken that and expanded that into, okay, now that you understand what a contract is, what are the questions you should be asking if you're on that board of ed, and also what are the negotiation
Hmm.
strategy and tactics going forward on how to combat, to give taxpayers a voice at the bargaining table. And that program now has been delivered in blue and red states. It was delivered in Houston, Texas, for city council members and police and fire. It's been delivered at West Point, Quinnipiac Law School, It's been spreading organically around the country, and now we finally have people seeking out and saying, "Hey, I want to take this class. What are the questions I should be asking for the Board of Ed?" When is the time when for a Board of Ed member to push to get something in a contract or to pass a policy? Do they understand what's a mandatory subject of bargaining in the state that they're in, a permissible subject of bargaining, and an illegal subject of bargaining? And we find a lot of good-hearted people out there now from Board of Eds that want to put permissible subjects of bargaining into contracts, thinking they're doing the right thing. No, if it's a permissible subject of bargaining, you never want to put it into the contract. That's when you do a Board of Education policy. And if you want to get a little into national politics, Megan Portfolio and I have an article coming out in the Daily Caller this week about what's going on in Minnesota. They're using ICE. The unions are using ICE to get remote learning. That failed subject. And how are they doing it? They're doing it through an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. And what most conservatives don't realize is that they think, oh, well, I'm on the Board of Ed, I vote for contracts. Well, when you voted for that contract, buried in that contract language, you give away your authority to one member of management and the union president to sign into an agreement that may not even have an expiration on it, that locks in contract law. So what the unions have done in St. Paul is they took the crisis. They said kids were afraid to go to school. They got an individual from the school board to sign an MOU for remote learning that doesn't have an end date on it. That should have never been negotiated.
Wow.
We know that remote learning has led to learning loss. It's a failed public policy. So why are we trying to create this? No, it's not about remote learning. It's about grabbing more power. So how's this translate if you're in Pennsylvania or if you're in Michigan right now or New York? Very simple. MOUs, because when they're signed, most times they don't even see the light of day. Or with sunshine laws or freedom of information laws, they don't, by the time they get revealed to the press, the news cycle has passed. So one thing that every Board of Ed and every town council and every state government should vote on as a policy is if an MOU is signed, it should be published on the website within 24 hours, because now the manager, the superintendent that has to sign that MOU knows that there's going to be public scrutiny, that here this policy is going to be up there. And all you have to do is simply do a quick review of the document to make sure that nothing needs to be redacted. And what needs to be redacted is very small under the law, because once the document is executed by management and labor, it's a public document. Just like a couple things that you can't put on a public document that would need to be redacted is the address of, say, a firefighter, judicial worker, or a police officer, or the results of a drug test. It's actually a very small thing. We're not talking about where you would need outside counsel to go through the document. You could literally just go through it and, hey, if this looks like, just redact it. But the document needs to be put out. And that public scrutiny would also not only prevent some of this absurdity from happening, it would also stop the backroom deals of protecting problematic employees who deserve no such protection from management side, where the manager isn't going to cut the backroom deal because he knows he's going to be held accountable in the press. So that alone is very, very powerful. And boards need to express to superintendents or whoever that individual is who can sign away contract languages that you just can't unilaterally go and sign away. You should have to bring that MOU to the Board of Education for a full vote. Why can't they do?
hmm So this class that Yankee Institute offers is
Yes.
you're the instructor, is that right? Oh, fantastic. Okay, so if a local municipality, if a school district wanted to
They'd reach
receive
out
that
to
kind of
Dave
training, what would
Osborne,
they
who would
do?
probably be working to host this through Commonwealth for thing, and we'll come up with some kind of agreement. But no, they could either reach out to you, they could reach out to me. We would love to talk to them, but it's only a 2-hour program. But then it usually ends up being a little bit more with questions. But we actually we'll do it one-on-one or do it in a large group, and we kind of break it down. And like I said, you were instrumental in the first part of it of just understanding the contract, and then we kind of expanded it past that of how do we use this information to hold people accountable. I just been going through a Board of Education budget, and it's literally like, and you're a great attorney, well respected. It's like a document dump, Dave. Like literally, they give you so much information in the Board of Education yearly summary that when you go through it, most citizen people are overwhelmed by it, or they give you so much data, but it's in such a small snapshot that you can't ascertain. Like you can find the number of students in one section, but then to find the number of staff, they don't break out that number. They list all of the actual individual. I just looked at one. They list all the individual things. So you have to count how many staff, but then they only give you in another section a snapshot of the budget for 3 or 4 years. No, if you're on the Board of Ed, there's certain charts you should be asking for your superintendent to create for you. In one instance, I thought this was hilarious. Sick time. People get sick, right? But teachers, and I love teachers, they're great, but they don't work a full year. Well, in Connecticut, the average sick time for a teacher statewide is 13 days. So this affects the kids because we want continuity of instruction, right? We want teachers there. This is very important for our children. So I asked the Board of Ed member, I said, well, ask the superintendent to take the 5 days a week and tell you what percent of the days off by all these teachers occur on Monday or Friday. And then do a special request and say, how many teachers take off the day after the Super Bowl? And the superintendent looked at her like she had 8 heads and was like, well, I don't have that information, but we don't have a sick problem. Well, I think that if Board of Education did that around the country, they're going to find that over 80% of their sick time occurs on a Friday or Monday. That means you have a problem. That means the superintendent's not doing their job, and there's ways to hold that individual accountable. But I think it was Drucker who said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And just because we're getting a lot of information from managers and state governments and everything doesn't mean that the information they're putting out is in a way that's easy to for a citizen person who's in a position as an elected official to actually make sense and say how these numbers work. Another great example of this, Dave, is, and I think Corey did a great job putting out this from Seattle, Washington, but every Board of Ed should duplicate this. Over the last 20 years, how many students have been enrolled for each year? And then how many teachers did you have for each year in a line graph? And then how many other staff members, paraprofessionals, curriculum assistant. So that's just 3 lines on a bar graph. Every individual Board of Education member should be asking the superintendent for that document. They're going to tell them they don't have it. And then you could do it the nice way first. Then request that when they do their annual book where they bury you in data, ask them to break out. And you want a line graph that tracks those 3 things. And then you want another graph that tracks the scores for reading, math, and all of those essential things. And then you want another graph that transposes those things. So we can actually measure outcomes, not just saying, oh, the kids are doing bad, we need to spend more money, or we need more teachers. Because I think the Commonwealth, Yankee, other think tanks have shown that just throwing money at the problem isn't the answer. We need to look at outcomes. Are these kids learning how to read and math? And again, the program's not just for the Board of Education, because I come from a fire background. So we cover, police, fire, and a lot of communities now are bringing us in to train their department heads, to train their superintendent, to train their HR. And we've been everywhere now. We've done for Democrats and for Republicans, and they're all blown away by the tricks, the games, and how the unions achieve what they achieve and why management keeps falling flat.
Well, that may be a good segue because I definitely want to ask you about your time as union president and including the kind of bargaining
I use them
tricks you
all,
might have
Dave. I
used
use them all.
in that context on the other end of the table. So tell me kind of what's the life of a typical local union president like? I mean, what are the jobs that he's asked to do for
A
the
lot of
union?
lunches. Now, look, I'm really critical when the union rep is taking the union's dues and they're spending money going to ridiculous conferences where they may go get 1 day of training and the rest of their 5 or 6 days is just basically a glorified, unbelievable expense paid vacation. So when I took in union leadership as president, and I was in union chairs for 16 years in the bluest of blue cities, I never lost an election. But when I became president, one of my pledges was I'm never going to go anywhere on your dime, but I'm going to eat lunch really good every day in the city. Okay. Because proximity is power. There wasn't anybody I didn't know. Matter of fact, I would make sure that the union would get gifts to every administrative assistant, work really hard to build relationships with people's secretaries, with administrative assistants. By the time I left, there wasn't anything that happened in the city that I didn't know about before the politicians knew about it. So building relationships is important, but I focused our union on wages, hours, and working conditions. That's what I focused on, is trying to get the best contract for my members. And I was very successful, and I used every trick that I could come up with to achieve that, because I had to understand process better than most people, because I couldn't get things done with relationships, because after winning a United States Supreme Court case against the city of New Haven, I was viewed as the devil, the white devil, which was the height of absurdity. But I had to beat them at their own game in process and through negotiation strategy and tactics. And I was able to successfully navigate that and deliver an unbelievable collective bargaining agreement, something that people thought it would never achieve. A matter of fact, I got Toni Harp, who President Trump called out at the White House that she blew off his meeting to go back to her sanctuary city. I got her in the first collective bargaining agreement in America to acknowledge and give pension credit to Space Force. And I would not endorse her. And I got our contract signed. So here's one strategy that's very important. And this isn't just like for local politics, this is even for international politics. Do you remember what the Taliban said when they were negotiating with, I think it was, might have been Biden at the time? They said, America has watches, we have time. Okay. So the unions look at negotiations as they're almost singularly focused on getting the best contract. So they're always playing chess. They're working it all the time. Management generally doesn't start working on their contract till 6 months before. This class gives you programs on how to actually prepare for negotiations all year round, because what happens in America is the labor director, HR director, sends an email to the department head 6 months before negotiations, says, what would you like to see in the next contract? And they tend to give 6 things, because at that time, they're preparing their budget. They're worried about other things. Most people didn't become a department head to do union negotiations. So you have to train them on how to prepare for negotiations throughout the year. So when they get that email, they already have the information. They're not putting something to the side. That's number one. I went into contract negotiations with over 100 proposals. We see conservative communities make mistakes all the time. They want to start off, because they don't understand negotiations. They start off by telling the administrators, we want to cut back on legal fees and the number of proposals, because that's the only thing they understand. Well, you just set yourself up to lose. You just set the table for the union. You need a lot of proposals. You need to be committed to going to arbitration so that in the end, you could settle quicker. I settled my contract before formal negotiations, in off-the-record negotiations, because I had 100 proposals. I had enough to trade to let the other side think that they're winning. So I'm sure you heard of win-win negotiations. Okay, well, there's a lot of literature out
I'm
there
not sure I
about
have. Yeah.
win-win negotiations. That's for good negotiators or average negotiators. You want to do win-win negotiations where you dictate how the other side wins, but you got to give them their win. You got to respect their politics. You got to give them their win so that they feel that they've accomplished this at the table, that they can sell this. And a lot of times managers and negotiators, they just don't understand what's going on. Here's a perfect example. You could have the greatest attorney in the world. If you don't give that attorney the right information or the right facts, that attorney is going to fail you, even though they know the law. And that's what we see. We see a lot of these municipalities, they bring in outside counsel, but they're not given the right information. They don't ask the right questions. They're not looking at the next contract. Even attorneys who negotiate contracts, David, all the time, what the ones that do it all the time, what they tend to do is they tend to take the same contract from municipality A, bring it to B, C, and D, and the unions are following it. The unions already know what the town is going to propose beforehand. So here's an example. You go into negotiations as a board of ed or as a municipality. You should have three piles because the union does, and management doesn't even realize it. Union management now goes in with two piles. They go in with a pile of proposals of what they would like to have and what would be nice to have. Okay. Well, the union always has three. And the third one is, what doesn't the other side want? Okay. Even though the union doesn't want it. So they're able to trade that away, but they sell it like they really, really want it. And management just does a poor job with that. Here, let's do this. I want to get something in a teacher's contract, but the union's saying no, 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 no. So if I wanted to do that, what would be a proposal that they wouldn't want? In a school system, normal school system, I would propose for the kids, always make the argument ESP, emotion, standards and statistics, professionalism, persistence. So start off with an emotional argument. Our teachers are the very best in this district. They are unbelievable, and our kids deserve the very best. So we want the ability to transfer any teacher within the school district within their certification with 1 day's notice, because we know the teachers care about the kids, and sometimes it takes the right teachers to motivate the kids. The teachers union will be showing up to every meeting with red shirts and everything else. You give that up and you get something substantial, but you got to give them the win.
Right.
They just don't understand how to play the game. There's another thing going around the country now in the leadership servants of circles of servant leadership. And I get calls from fire chiefs and police chiefs and superintendents who embrace this servant leadership thing. And they go, I went into negotiations and I said, I'm not going to play games. This is what I can get for you. And I think it's the very best. And they're actually genuine. They're like negotiating in good faith. They're saying, this is what I can get for you. And then all of a sudden the union goes, we want more. And then they file a no confidence vote. And they're calling me up and saying, what just happened here? I was for the teachers. I was for the firefighters. I'm like, it's negotiations.
Yeah.
Just because you don't negotiate in your life, you have to negotiate in contracts. And here, when you go in and say, this is your position to union, any union, they would be wrong to accept that position. They're going to always fight for more. So you have to know your enemy and know what your enemy, and I don't mean enemy, but your opposing side. You got to know what's there. But there's a way to respect employees, respect our great teachers, respect our great firefighters, respect our police. I mean, and talk about police and fire, anybody who would make their wife a widow or their husband a widow and their kids parentless for the community they serve, they need to be treated with respect. But often we see that the taxpayers don't even have a seat at the table. So we want to bring balance back to the bargaining table where taxpayers and parents have a seat at the table. There's a way to do it. And I think that I got to give a lot of credit to Carol Platt-Liebau because she really saw what Dave, you and I built on with how to understand a contract of now we need to take this to the next level and put how do we negotiate against the unions and how do we turn this in so that the taxpayers do have a voice. And when I say enemy and negotiate against, I just want to make sure your listeners realize that negotiations are designed through state and federal law to be adversarial in nature. So the language lends itself. It's basically both sides balancing their interests to come to an agreement. So there's definitely strategies. The arbitration angle is another one, Dave, that we see all the time where towns will negotiate robust contracts. They'll reach impasse. And then to save on legal fees, they'll say, oh, we only want to go to arbitration with 3 issues or 6 issues. Well, of course, you're going to lose in arbitration and the union's going to roll the dice and see what they say because they're not risking anything. They're just there. Yeah, it's just you need enough issues so that you could settle outside in the hall of arbitration that the union's got to know that if this goes to arbitration, they have just as much to lose as the town. It just seems to be such a backwards process that the towns really don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I've seen some unions with a pretty good deal already, and what they'll do is they'll do a printout of particular portions of the contract. And you can tell that they've put some work into it because they've taken it, they've lifted out of the agreement and printed it in a Word document and printed it out. And then they'll say, we want to talk about this provision. And what that does is sort of take it out of the context of the collective bargaining agreement so that that the government, in this case, wouldn't even think about an alternative like trading something that they've already got in the contract. Instead, they're locked in on this one sheet of paper, and they're basically trying to
They're
split
winning
the baby
100%, and that
here. But
happens
of course,
all
the
the
union's
time. And
winning if they're
all
doing
these
that.
good, like,
They've really,
I barely graduated high school, but all these highly educated labor attorneys, okay, they go into negotiations and they want to simplify their life, and they always want to say, we're going to negotiate benefits here if allowed. We're going to negotiate work rule changes here, and then we're going to do wages. They bifurcate it, and it's management that's bifurcated it. And I've had localities call me up and be like, we lose on wages all the time. And I'm like, well, if you're an affluent community, why are you negotiating wages by itself? Well, that's what our attorney said. Well, no, on any issue that you might be a little weak on, you got to bring in another issue into that negotiations that you're strong on. So take that language that you're looking at that they're bringing that they parsed out. Well, yeah, we're going to talk about this, but our trade for this is we need some reasonable concessions on healthcare, you know. And when we look at, going so far
mhm,
now,
mhm.
I understand anchoring, and like the Trump administration does a great job with that, starting off high, get to somewhere in the middle. But sometimes you need to just strive for the middle. Like a lot of state governments are out of control, but the municipalities are in reason. Look at your state, look at Pennsylvania, look across the country. Is there parity between state employees and municipal employees? If there's not, that's an easier sell, is to say we need to bring parity between our state employees and municipal employees. I'll give you just like three quick examples. Take the state of Connecticut. State employees are paying about 2% into their health care. Municipal employees are paying 17% into their health care. State employees are paying 3 to 6% into their pension. Firefighters and cops in the cities are paying 12% into their pension. Just those two things alone can make a big difference. Oh, outside counsels, David, very important. So you're on the Board of Ed, you're on some council, and they say, we want to bring in a lawyer to look at this situation from the outside. First off, we outsource way too much in America. Like, why do we hire the very best for the job and take the superintendent. Why do we hire somebody who's a doctor of education when they can't even do an education study? We got to pay some outside consultant to do it. They're not capable of doing it. Why don't we just hire a high school graduate and let them outsource the study to the PhD? We'd save a lot of money. So that's number one. Okay. Let's go to number two. The other thing they do is when a superintendent or a manager makes a bad decision, they'll get outside counsel. But the Board of Ed or the town council, when they bring in that outside counsel, the first question they should ask that outside counsel, the first charge of that vote to bring in that independent investigation, if you're going to bring it in, is we want you to evaluate the facts and determine if the city or municipality or state would be better to settle now than go forward. That doesn't happen. That question's not asked. So what happens is the lawyer comes in and they're not talking to the governing body. They talking to that superintendent who already violated somebody's rights, who already established bad facts, who already made a bad decision. And they tell the lawyer to double down on their ridiculousness. So now what happens is the taxpayers get billed all this money. And then when
Mhm.
they get to the end, right before the end, the lawyer has that hard conversation with everybody and says, oh, we're going to lose. We need to settle. After years of legal bills, simply by not asking that question, we need you to first evaluate the case. Who's got the better case? Would we better off to settle now? That's how outside counsel should be brought in. Not we're going to come in and we're just going to back up a manager who violated just the general tenets of good governance. So I'm sorry, I just kind of go.
So I didn't know we were going to go in this direction, but this is absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So the outside counsel that they bring in, Do you often find that the outside counsel is
I was
more
talking, my
deferential
example
to
was
the
in a
unions than they should
disciplinary
be?
situation where what happens is the outside counsel comes in and they're representing management,
Sure, yeah.
and what they do is they just double down to protect the superintendent. They act as a defense attorney for the superintendent or for the department head, say the police chief. They act as a defense attorney without actually putting the interests of the taxpayers first. So if they're coming in to represent management, you need, and it's about a specific issue, especially anything on discipline, you need to ask, hey, should this case be, we need you to evaluate this case first and report back in executive session. Should we settle this, or do we fight this out?
Especially when the incentive for any attorney is, that works on an hourly basis is to bill, So, yeah, ask them up front what they think. See if you can get some good counsel
Absolutely, and
before
we
you go
see
down
that
that
in
track.
every
'Cause,
town,
man,
small
it's going to be
town,
tens of thousands of dollars if
large
you don't.
city.
That's
It's a
fascinating,
way to
Frank.
really drain resources and protect managers that are failing in their job. Like I said, you got to make sure you hold the union accountable, but the union's doing what the union is designed to do. It's that scorpion and frog crossing the river there. The fact is, the union's going to do what the union does.
Hmm.
Well, we have more control over what
Hmm.
management does, but yet there's no accountability on managers. And, to use that disciplinary example again, so often when the union wins and gets an employee back to work who should have been fired, what is the superintendent or the department head, the police chief, fire chief, what, DPW director, what do they say? They go to the council and they say, it's the union's fault. And nobody asks any other questions. That's it. They'll have some people write op-eds against the union. The
Hmm.
union's invoking John Adams. The chances are the union president knows that the person's a scumbag and should be disciplined, but they have a fiduciary duty. But nobody asks the next question. The next question to the supervisor is, if you have just cause in your contract, it's not some ambiguous, magical, mystical thing. It doesn't fly in on a unicorn. It's seven things established by a arbitrator. How did the union win? Even in the bluest state of Connecticut, when the union goes to the labor board, we're actually behind the eight ball. And I never lost the case at the labor board. Okay. We're behind the eight ball. The only way the unions get the cards is the manager fails to do one of the seven things that could be on a checklist. And so the next question for the Board of Ed to that superintendent is, what part of just cause did you violate? Why was this overturned? They don't ask that. They just blame the union. And that gives the union more
You're
power,
right.
because
Yeah.
when they used to do that to me all the time and say, oh, well, they got this guy off because Frank Ricci, that just built my power and credibility in the city. They were helping me out. I love when they did it, but they wouldn't hold the manager accountable to say, hey, what happened here? And then when management fails to do their job, they don't hold them accountable. I'll give you an example. I had a deputy chief get hired in the city. Okay. He just got promoted to deputy chief. He thought he had a better way of doing the contract. So he started hiring overtime differently. So I filed a grievance. And if they evaluated it on the merits, it would have cost them $300 to settle and be done with it. But instead, management wanted to back their deputy chief. By the time I was done with them a year later, the city had to give a vacation day to 367 firefighters. Now, those 367 firefighters, when they're off, now you got to hire overtime to come back. That was probably a $400,000 to $800,000 cost to the city. That could have cost them $300, and they knew he was violating the contract. So, do you think that deputy chief got disciplined? Do you think he got written up or suspended? No, they settled the grievance, and
Hmm.
nothing happened
Hmm.
to the deputy chief. It defies logic. So if the union
Hmm.
wins, the question is, why did they win? How did the manager violate just cause? And then here, I'll give you something really funny about the state of Connecticut. And this happens in Pennsylvania and happens everywhere else. So a Connecticut inside investigator does an investigation on one of the governor's staff and finds out he's driving. I don't quote me on the number. It was absurd. I think it was like 103 or 90 miles an hour on a regular basis, like across the state on GPS. So they have his GPS there. Now, this person's not even a union employee. So, but even if they're a union employee, what Board of Education members and town council members don't understand, and state reps, is that there's a Supreme Court case called Garrity. Now, Garrity came out of New Jersey. Now, Garrity means that you can compel any employee to answer any question you have. There's no Fifth Amendment for employment law. The catch is that whatever you uncover in the investigation cannot be shared with the DA or district attorney. Why do you care about that? Why wouldn't you grant Garrity in every situation and don't share anything with the prosecutor? Because let them do their own investigation. It doesn't preclude the state from doing an investigation. You literally can ask them any question, and labor law has it such that if they fail to answer the question, it's insubordination, and you can write them up, and that can start progressive discipline all the way up to termination for not answering a question. So here you have this person driving, well over 90 miles an hour across the state, endangering the public. Instead of the governor bringing him in and saying, here's the data, I'm granting Garrity. We're not going to say anything to the prosecutor. Give it to him in writing. Have the lawyer sign off on it, and then say, were you the one driving the car? He would have said yes, because he was an honest individual. And I find most employees are actually honest. They're good, hardworking people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes good people make bad decisions. I know I do all the time. So what do you call it? All they had to do was ask him, and he would have said, yes, that was me. Well, you could then fire him right then and there. You can start the process of then, you got his side of the story. Now you can schedule a hearing. You follow the 3 or 4 steps, and you could actually fire him. But no, what did the governor of Connecticut do? Hired an outside law firm, paid him $75,000 of the taxpayers to go through for a couple months, and then the employee, of course, took responsibility for their irresponsible actions and resigned. That's a $75,000. I could have fixed that whole issue in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Literally 10 minutes, and then 3 months of process, and then the person would have been gone. So
Yeah. Well, what's the solution? So I hear you saying that management needs to be more prepared for negotiations. They need to deal, in disciplinary context with some adherence to the contract, actually get the thing done.
yeah,
Is
they
there
have to
anything
hold
that the
management
state
accountable. They
legislature
have
can
to,
do to
like
sort
in
of
that
level
governor's
the playing
situation, they have
field
to
or
say,
encourage this kind of
why
behavior
aren't we granting
from
Garrity? Why are
from?
we mismanaging the workforce? Why aren't we managing the workforce? I mean, simply as a policy for disciplinary issues, the Board of Ed, the state legislature can pass that. They will grant Garrity, and they will basically depose anybody in disciplinary things with the proper union rep. You can ask questions for, give them a break, let them go to the bathroom, let them have coffee, whatever. But you can ask somebody questions for 2 hours. You can just ask it, and they're compelled to answer it. And most people who are in elected office don't even realize that. And the only thing is, the lawyers try to say, well, Garrity, well, grant him Garrity, write out a form. Why do you care what the prosecutor is going to do, no matter what the issue is? And the other thing in labor law that a lot of individuals don't realize is that the just cause standard is it's not parallel. Sometimes it's a little above, sometimes it's a little below, is right there with just cause. So Connecticut just had a labor board decision upheld a firing where the person was arrested, okay? So they were arrested, they were ended up being terminated, and then the court case found them innocent. Well, being found innocent is a higher standard. The labor board, because management did everything right, because management checked the box, because some of those managers went through my class, checked the box, that was upheld because the standard of just cause is lower than the standard of being innocent beyond all reasonable doubt. So here he was he was innocent of the crime, but because he was arrested for, I believe, sexual assault or rape, and the manager did everything right, he got fired, and it upheld. So there's a whole negotiating part that's there, and there's a whole disciplinary part that's there. That's the next thing I want to work on Yankee with is a class on discipline. But we have the negotiating there. We hit a little bit on discipline, but discipline needs to be taken out in another look. But we really need to educate people.
I mean, it sounds like you're talking about leadership. I mean, that would be a great thing to have in government. Fantastic. One of the things I like about that too is that if you're in a blue state like Connecticut, if you're in a purple state like Pennsylvania, These are things that can be done without, getting the legislature to pass a new reform, which is powerlessly difficult. And unions, if they own Hartford or in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, they're going to jump onto that process and they're going to add a bunch of things to any new union reform you have, and it's ultimately going to be very watered down. Whereas if you're demonstrating true leadership in your government,
Absolutely, Dave,
you
and
can actually get
Dave,
a
you
lot
can
of things
accomplish
done,
things
even
in
with the
collective
existing
bargaining in blue
guardrails.
cities too. So
That, I
I'm going to
mean,
give
that's
you an example,
fantastic. Well,
something that
Frank,
should spread
where can
around, something
people?
that Yankee was advocating for years, and we saw it put in place in New Haven. Now, New Haven doesn't have one Republican in the city council or the office. You'd have a better chance of seeing Tyrannosaurus Rex walk down Whaley Avenue than to see a Republican in New Haven. So there's no such thing. But yet, in their last police contract, not through arbitration, through negotiating skills, they got that if a police officer is arrested for a felony, they're on unpaid administrative leave. However, it doesn't preclude the department from doing their own investigation and rendering discipline. However, if the charges are dropped by the prosecutor or they are found innocent, they get full back pay. But now what that does is I believe that's really good governance, because now when the police officer beat their wife like 8 times and now they get arrested for a felony, you don't have the police chief on the news saying the person's on unpaid administrative leave for a year. No, and if they accept the deferment, which I believe is in the bargaining history, or accelerated
Right, right.
rehabilitation, that does not count as being innocent. Because believe it or not, if you're a law-abiding citizen and you get arrested for a felony and you haven't been arrested before, it's real easy to get that felony knocked down through AR or accelerated rehabilitation. So you want to make sure that you have language in there. But that language should be there just for an arrest. I think that language could be expanded and say, hey, if you're arrested and you're a state or municipal employee, you're on unpaid administrative leave, and it doesn't stop the municipality. That would definitely be an incentive for people to behave, because why are we paying all these people? People are getting paid millions of dollars. Taxpayers are losing millions of dollars a year. I would assume in Pennsylvania, I know in Connecticut, just on administrative leave, on people that they're paying for a year to be out of work.
Yeah, sure.
yankeeinstitute.org or
Well,
labormanagement.org,
Frank, where can
and
people find out more about your
can
work?
contact me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Frank Ricci, DC.
Yeah, you've got a
All right.
great Twitter feed. What's your handle?
Honored to be on your show. Check out our latest article in
Frank
the
Ricci
Daily
DC. Okay,
Caller
we'll check
on
it
what's
out.
going on
Well,
with
Frank,
unions
thanks for
and
joining
ICE
us.
in Minnesota. Honored to be on your show. Thank you very much, Dave.
Sure thing. Appreciate it.